In order for students to read with enough fluency to support comprehension, they need to learn and use vocabulary to make sense of what they are reading. Students who learn vocabulary during hands-on science learn content and develop the lexicon bank necessary for reading comprehension. Veronica Gallardo. This month on It's Time for Science, it's time to talk about English language development and science instruction. Diana B. Vélez and Veronica Gallardo are here to talk about the importance of connecting ELD and science instruction, the correlation of oral vocabulary and the ability to read words, and the research and experience supporting active science as one of the best places to develop language skills. And stick around at the end because producer David Lipman also has a few words about Amy Tan's amazing book, The Backyard Bird Chronicles, published by Knopf. It's time for science, and it's time to talk about English language development, or ELD, and specifically how it relates to the teaching of science. With us today are two experts in the field to talk about connecting science and language development with specific real-world application in the Santa Barbara School District. Diana Vélez is a curriculum developer and professional learning provider for the Full Option Science System project, known as FOSS, at the Lawrence Hall of Science. She specializes in English language development and the integration of literacy in science teaching and learning. And Veronica Gallardo is a bilingual reading specialist and science consultant. In the last 15 years, she's held multiple professional and volunteer roles: a kindergarten, first grade, and middle school teacher, site administrator for 2 elementary schools, and volunteers her time in support of community literacy initiatives. So, Diana and Veronica, welcome.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Great to be here.
We have talked about this on the podcast a little bit here and there, and I'm very excited to get into depth about it. But ELD is very much, when we talk about it, is focused on as a separate subject. But let's start off by talking about the importance of connecting science and language development and why that's so effective. So, Deanna, why don't we start with you with that?
Well, it really isn't disconnected. It's part of content learning. So sometimes it's necessary to focus on some discrete sort of language demands and functions and that sort of thing. But really, language develops in content where students are using the language to make sense of what they're learning, to communicate with others what they're learning. So it really should not be looked at as a separate content or a separate area, because it really is about developing English language or whatever your target language is in the context of what you're learning at school.
Veronica?
Absolutely. My lens with being a reading specialist, Tom, and just reading and listening to kids for a number of years, oral vocabulary is directly correlated to a child's ability to read words. And when we're thinking about one of the best modalities in which children are going to acquire the necessary vocabulary to read with enough fluency to support comprehension, I can't think of a better context that not only the research supports, but that we have seen in the classroom. And that context is active science, hands down.
I know, as it's come up a few times, it makes perfect sense because kids get very excited about science and they have to explain a concept or something in their own language and then find out the English version of that. And it just seems very, very natural. It seems like such a wonderfully natural combination. You guys have been working with the Santa Barbara School District, where it's quite a project. I wanted, Deanna, if you could talk about a little bit how that came about. How did this relationship with Santa Barbara happen? And then we'll go into detail about how it's been going and what it's been like.
Yeah, sure. So just as you mentioned, science is that perfect context for language development. And Santa Barbara recognized that right away as when they were using the FOSS curriculum, and students were excited and they were really just couldn't wait to communicate their ideas. And so there was a lot of oral language happening using notebooks. So they were now had something exciting to write about in their notebooks. So all of that was working really well in terms of content and language development. And they were also using a lot of strategies such as GLAD to also support their emergent multilingual learners. so that was going well, but in California, we have what's called designated English language development, and that is a required time that emergent multilingual learners are supposed to receive very targeted ELD instruction that is at their proficiency level. So a lot of districts will pull something off the shelf, so to speak. A lot of times these programs are focused on ELA. The content, if they have it, does not align with standards like the next generation science standards, or even some state standards. So they wanted something very authentic. They wanted something that was meaningful for students. They wanted it to connect to the science that they were learning, because they also wanted to keep the science kind of going, because it can lose, when there's all sorts of other demands around ELA and math. And so they wanted to make sure that teachers felt like that science was a priority to continue teaching. So we have, at FOSS, we have a lot of resources for teachers and ELD specialists to plan and create lessons and a trajectory for their students in ELD. And so we developed these resources, and they're very comprehensive for every grade level. And they were excited about using those. So we met with them, and this was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And we met with their literacy coaches, and we came up with a framework for how, because basically the issue was they really liked the resources, but teachers didn't have the time to actually plan the lessons. So we were going to do that for them, and their literacy coaches were going to help and do that. And it quickly became apparent that this was a really big deal, and that it required a lot of expertise. It required a lot of time. And so it turned into a 2-year project, and that continues today as we're continually updating. And so what we actually came out with, we worked with their ELD specialists, and we're able to come up with lessons and units that align with our FOSS science program. So now teachers can teach science using embedded ELD, and they also now have lessons where they can teach the designated ELD, and that aligns with what they're doing in science. So that was we're pretty excited about that, and we're actually trying to get some funding to be able to expand that at the national level and align with the WIDA standards that most states in the country are using.
Well, it's great that we're helping teachers with time, because we all know that teachers have plenty of time on their hands, all sorts of time just laying around doing nothing with. So it's great that we're offering this too. Veronica, what is your role with having been work with them? I know you've been a site supervisor, so you're there in the trenches, as we say. So what is your take on what Santa Barbara's doing?
Yeah, well, I got to be one of the teacher leads working with the amazing folks at the hall, which includes Deanna. And so, really, in this journey of thinking of FOSS and language, Tom, it was really looking at teachers have resources, right? We have lots of different frameworks, different things that we're working with. And so knowing that in the end, we know we want kids to be literate, speaking, listening, reading, and writing, and those things working in tandem. And just like Deanna described, I mean, really, it was really apparent just as we kicked the tires with FOSS that this was more than just active science, that while kids were doing active science, they were on their way to becoming fluent readers and writers because they were acquiring the necessary vocabulary and language skills that were being learned in just this multisensory modality that we know is not just good for kids with dyslexia or learning disabilities. It just happens to be good for teaching and the way folks learned. And so being a consultant with FOSS, then getting to dive in there and working with small cohorts of teachers, grade levels, and really looking at what in California specifically, we have a pretty meaty English language arts, English language development framework. And so to peel all that back and just at a high level, to look at our science and engineering practices and just to look at what is it that the kids are being asked to do? And so if we know kids are going to, for example, explain, we can talk about, okay, well, then that's the function of language. Why are we having kids talking? Because they're going to explain. If the kids are describing, okay, well, what are they going to do there? And so it's really taking that sort of view on just asking that question, why are the kids talking? Are they explaining? Are they describing? Are they analyzing? Are they arguing? And knowing that we had already spent all this time in amazing science, whether it's fourth grade, looking at all of the rocks, or second grade towers, goodness, kindergarten leaves, sixth grade with air, you name it. We said, well, we've already spent all this time. Why not then take it that other level, which is what Deanna's describing, which is that designated time where we know that kids are going to learn best when they're learning in context. So we have a context, we taught it. Let's pick up from there so that this idea of learning, speaking, listening, reading, and writing becomes cohesive, right, Tom? And not just something that's out there, and it's just really working in tandem with that instructional day of what we do.
How have the teachers responded to this? Were there obstacles to overcome? People who may not feel like they're qualified to do this, or that it was a whole new thing, or did the teachers really embrace this? Deanna, how did the teachers sort of react to this whole thing that you guys have been doing?
There's the range, just like anything that's a little new. You're going to have people that are excited, and then others that are just going to kind of question whether this is effective. And Veronica could probably speak more to present day, but I know when we did it years ago, when we started in the pilot, teachers were really appreciative of actually having these lessons that were developed and that saved them the time to do that. And one of the results of that we're seeing, or at least initially, and again, Veronica could speak to this now, was one of the goal is to help teachers see kind of what we call pull back the curtain, to quote Holly Hill, who's part of Santa Barbara, is to pull back the curtain in language. And because when you're if English is your first language, you're not really aware of all those nuances of language, that because so much of learning literacy, like Veronica was saying, is based on oral language. So if you grew up hearing all the way kind of things are said and the way we communicate, it's then just a matter of, okay, how do I write that? All right, or how I can repeat that because I've learned and I've listened to that. When you're learning another language, that's not what you don't have that repertoire right yet. You're still learning that's why the oral piece is so important. And so this pulling back the curtain, so to speak, and how do we communicate in science? What are those vocabulary, not just the vocabulary, because they're all learning new vocabulary words because these are new concepts, but also those just ways of like transition words and cause and effect words, things that we just kind of flow because they're natural for us if we're speaking English. But for students, they need to kind of, this is how you say when I want to compare this to that. There's a way of communicating that so that others can understand what it is you're trying to communicate. So I think that was one of the results. And what the beauty of these lessons also is that they're supposed to be done in small groups. And so when teachers were able to organize that structure and spend time with students, it was so impactful for them to see, oh yeah, my students do know this, right? If I give them the space where they can communicate their understanding in a place where they feel like they can do that, right? And given the tools to do that, then the teachers see that the students are capable of doing so much more than maybe they thought they could.
Veronica, would you like to weigh in on that? As Deanna said, you're more on the ground now with it. How have the teachers responded to it, and how has it worked for them?
Yeah, so I'm gonna make a noun, a verb here, because that's what we do in science, right? So seasonality, is that a thing? Can I say the seasonality of the rhythm of teaching? Nominalization, that's one thing we do in science a lot, right? We take a noun and all of a sudden we make it a thing. It's a process. So I'm gonna say the seasonality of just the teacher rhythm. And so Tom, we're have this now post season now where our schools are settled back into what are more typical school years, right? And we had what we had the last couple of years, and that was that. So when we launched this work, in a model that we had in a lot of districts, not unique to Santa Barbara, but where you have models where you have teacher leaders or teacher TOSAs or different structures like that, like we did in Santa Barbara. Yeah, certainly. I mean, that's how I got to work so closely with Deanna and our different leadership teams in Santa Barbara. And so when we have something like that, it really allowed us to not just kick the tires, but because one thing that FOSS does really well is FOSS does really good teaching and learning. And so when Deanna always reminds me, FOSS it's a philosophy, it's a way of doing something, right? That works really well for kids. Well, when Deanna and Brian and the team came down to Santa Barbara, we weren't just in teacher PD, right? Like someone's up there doing their thing. The philosophy of FOSS really was infused within the professional learning time. So when you get to experience something like that, Tom, it really gets everybody thinking and talking about the way children learn, and you're able to then go back and apply that. We had the benefit of working with the hall, and we had full days of lesson studies. So when Dan is talking about this work of the ELD and really taking up those lessons, that's really how this all came about. Now, fast forward years later, where we're at now, with there's a couple variables, Tom, and one of them is the new teacher that is entering the classroom today, right? And so, and that's expected, right? You always have different waves of retirements and different things like that. And so what we're seeing with new teachers now, and as we're working with administrators in districts across the state where I have shared this work that Deanna is describing with the ELD units, there's excitement, Tom. There's excitement because we're a pretty comprehensive state already, and I mentioned the multiple frameworks we have. So when a teacher leader can get something like what Deanna and was just describing with the ELD lessons, you have something that's as comprehensive as anything that's available at the market now. I mean, I can't think of anything that's more comprehensible that's available to teachers where they can look at specifically a language function, the different ranges of development, emerging, bridging, expanding, and then have a nice vignette of what that lesson would look like, all within a quick 30-minute flow that directly ties back into what we already want kids to do in the classroom, right? And so a lot of what we hear with, especially in middle school, is the kids aren't able to write a claim yet, right? And so how do we do that? Well, it starts with the phenomena first, getting them engaged into some wonderment, and then they're talking. And before they're going to make that bridge into encoding or writing, we have to have all these authentic conversations. And so they're excited, especially our middle school teachers right now, because they are getting that wave of kids, for just the way schooling was in the last couple of years. So now a lot of middle school teachers are really seeing themselves as disciplinary teachers of speaking, listening, reading, and writing in the science, because that's what the demographic and just the need of what that child needs right now. And so it's an exciting time, and it's exciting for me to get to work with such authentic product that's then paired with great service and delivery support, which was all birthed out of the work, that Deanna and the folks at the hall put together. So it's good times. There's good optimism. If that's what, if I would say anything, is there are some fiery, amazing administrators and teachers out there, and there's a lot of good things happening. And so a lot of optimism, Tom.
That's great. It's I just love learning more about this from my perspective, because it's such an obvious thing of kids having to discuss these things and turn those into thoughts and into words and into writing. It's such a wonderful process. And one of my favorite aspects of science, especially, is when kids make that connection, when they see something and have that aha moment. I was wondering if you have any just fun little story of a kid that you just, who doesn't necessarily speak English first, who had that moment where it's like, oh, I figured this out and now I can express it. Do you have anything like that to see how is it working with the kids?
Oh my gosh. Well, we actually got to do a science, a STEAM summer program with our district down south, Capistrano School District, and this was all a cohort of kids in the summertime, and they invited us in to partner with them after sharing, this work that we've been doing. And so, yes, Tom, I mean, to go into the classroom and see a child that does not yet have the expressive vocabulary to be able to communicate some aspect about something. And so, for example, I was with a cohort of young primary, so second going into third, but still that young primary age. And so we have towers, right? Solids, liquids, physical science, and FOSS. And so one of the things in the ELD is, well, before we're going to talk about, towers, like we want to think about attributes, right? Well, what's an attribute? Well, an attribute's like could be a sound. It could be like property. We talk about properties. We talk about character traits in ELA. So to work with these kids and to be able to look at a character like that they're familiar with and talk about like, well, what is that character like? Whether it's the way their hair looks or like what their eye color is, etc. And then to really kind of make that T-chart to think about, okay, when we're thinking of objects have some similarities like that. And so we talk about those as attributes. And so, or we talk about the properties of an object. And so what are the properties of this like thing right here? And like without even naming it yet, and then they're dropping it, they hear a sound, they're touching it. Oh, well, we call that a metal washer. What do you think? So then now, Tom, from there, it just takes off. You're either going to end up with kids sorting things, you're going to end up with kids like wanting to organize them by shape, by color, whatnot. And then where we come in as reading language teachers is that we come in with helping them formulate that expressive ability to talk about what this is, and whether we're bringing in, multisensory skills, probably work with kids with dyslexia, knowing what we know about the way sounds are made, to see kids like full on talking to each other and forming sentences and like we just met them, like maybe half an hour ago. Yes, it's huge. It's invigorating. It makes that plane travel or that night at the hotel, whatever it is, it makes it all worth it because this is why we do what we do. We show up for kids, and like FOSS has just put together this great philosophy of doing it. And so little kids lighting up. Tom, yeah, you're gonna
That's
come
the
in next
best.
time. Yes.
Yeah.
Dan, do you want to
Well,
add anything?
it's been a while since I've been able to, and I really miss not being in the classroom. But there was a project that we were working on around argumentation in the Oakland school district. And we have this video. It's just my favorite. I show it all the time because it's fifth graders. They were doing our mixtures and solutions and learning about mixtures and solutions. And the teacher just really focused on the language of argumentation. And so she and this group of students, she had this one, they just loved to just engage in this sort of discourse. And she would have them in a circle and they would talk about what they had learned, and they were in what we call our sense making discussions. And they would use language like, I agree with you, but I have evidence that shows this, and based on our experience, the investigation we did, we learned this, but our reading, and it's just so wonderful to hear them expressing themselves in this way, and not just that they're using it, but they're so engaged, like they're just so excited about what they're talking about. And they're talking about what's the definition of a mixture versus a solution, and so I had not seen that level of engagement, and I just and I think again that's like the power of having students do hands-on investigations where they're collecting data on their own, right? Not something they read about, something they all do, so they all have that same experience. And now they are fully engaged when it comes to talking about it, sharing their ideas, and then writing about it, right? And then reading about it, because it's all something that makes sense to them, and they're excited about it.
That's like the one word summary, isn't it? Engagement is like the key to the whole thing, the foundation of the whole thing. If they're engaged, they're going to learn. I think that's awesome. Which also brings me to sort of what I wanted to wrap up with was about equity in the classroom, because we talk about that, making sure that all kids have access to as much as they can across the board to have access to a solid science education. And this definitely sounds like that assists with it, because they're all getting involved. They're all having a chance. No one's being left out. So Veronica, I just wanted you to maybe talk a little bit about how ELD relates to equity in the classroom.
You know, without this way of teaching and learning, I don't see how we can reach all kids and provide them what they need. You know, Tom, there's variability in the rate of development for all kids. Even for typically developing a child, there's going to be variability in their language or in their literacy. And so when we're thinking about giving all kids what they need in that moment for that class period, the opportunities for teachers to be able to springboard individually for kids, it's like nothing else, right? And so I think that you can't have equity in the classroom without the practice of speaking, listening, reading, and writing all in tandem at the same time that you're doing science. Even with middle school kids, because we're attending so much to how they're changing developmentally, emotionally, there's so much going on. When you put magnets in front of them, like, they're like, why did that happen? You know, and you just let them go with it. You let them run with it. And you are teaching emotional intelligence, you're teaching the science engineering practices, but more importantly, as a teacher, like, there's no more pulling kids to like a corner or sending them off to like a computer to take a test. Like, the amount of data, Tom, that you can collect on where the kids need, it's huge. And so that's, to me, why I think there's no better way to teach, to read, without having science at the center of it. It's just hands down for all kids, all demographics. So it's, you can tell it's my joy, it's my passion. So
that's why you're here. I love it. Deanna, anything to add to that about equity and ELD?
Yeah, I mean, I think Veronica really hit it on the head. And I always say, if you teach the FOSS or, you know, any other program like ours, but that is focusing on having a shared experience where students can engage and figure things out on their own and with partners, then you're like 80% of the way there in terms of language development, because that, as we've been saying, that's where kids are really, they're using language in context. They're using language to communicate and to figure things out. And then I do think, though, that there is this need to also center the needs of particular students and make sure that you know what it is that student needs in order to fully participate in those sense-making discussions and accessing the curriculum the way the whole class is. So I think hand in hand, those two things, just that shared experience and also really knowing your students, knowing what it is, what are their assets and what is it that they need to work on.
That's great, because as Veronica said, you're right there getting all that data right from them. I think that's amazing. So, well, Deanna and Veronica, thank you so much for being here. This is a fascinating subject, and you guys are the experts, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom.
Happy to be here.
Producer David Lippman here. Back in episode 13, we were lucky enough to have principal innovator of the global nature journaling movement, John Muir Laws, on the podcast. It's a great episode if you haven't had a chance to listen. One of the many people who have worked with Mr. Laws over the years is the novelist Amy Tan, author of many books, including The Bonesetter's Daughter and The Joy Luck Club. When I learned that Ms. Tan, a personal favorite author, had written her own book about nature journaling, The Backyard Bird Chronicles, I absolutely had to get my hands on a copy. It's frankly an amazing book. Structured as a series of notebook entries with drawings ranging from 2017 to 2022, the full-color images are striking, and the writing is a window into sitting and absorbing and recording the natural world. The drawings run the gamut from playful and fun to amazingly intricate, and all serve as an inspiration to those of us, and I'm including myself in this most definitely, who aren't so sure we can draw to save our lives. Ms. Tan didn't begin drawing until she was 64. Two of my personal favorite illustrations include a crime scene, a murder of crows full of the notes and observations and often humor included with most of the entries, and a detailed drawing of a California scrub jay. While I usually review media and games for our students, this is a book for us as educators. It's just a wonderful, inspirational piece of art that also provides a record of some amazing nature journaling. Here's a quote from Ms. Tan used for one of the classes she taught with Mr. Laws in June 2024. My start in nature journaling and drawing came through workshops with John Muir Laws, co-founder of the Wild Wonder Foundation. I not only learned to draw, I discovered I could live more deeply in the moment with curiosity, awe, and gratitude. It was restorative in a time of turmoil. Thank you to Ms. Tan for this wonderful book, and thank you to Knopf for giving us a copy, and thank you all for listening.
It's Time for Science is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lippman and Tom Racine, and is sponsored by School Specialty and FOSS, the full option science system, at the Lawrence Hall of Science, UC Berkeley. Be sure to check out FOSS over on Facebook and Twitter.